Welcome to Thalira Tales, where stories bloom in silence, carrying emotion, mystery, and hidden truth. Step in and let the tale unfold.
I believed I was the luckiest woman alive, until my husband went away on a business trip. Wanting to surprise him, I hired a painter to redo our bedroom. 2 hours later, the painter called me in a panic. "There's a hidden door behind the closet, and there's a woman tied up inside. I think you need to get here right now." I rushed home and uncovered a horrifying secret. That's when I realized the man who kissed my forehead every night was a monster, hiding behind the mask of a perfect gentleman. Before we go any further, I just want to say, I'm genuinely grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, anything. It means the world to me to know who's in this with me. Note this story contains some fictional elements for educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is worth your time. For 2 years, my husband prepared my vitamins every single night. At the time, I was still the woman who smiled as I took the glass from his hand, entirely unaware that what he was actually preparing was my funeral. My name is Avery Miller. At 25 years old, my life looked like something clipped from the most perfect vision boards. I lived in a 4-bedroom estate on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, a property with its own name, the Miller Estate. It was my family's house, shielded from the world by iron gates and ancient oak trees. 6 months ago, on my 25th birthday, a trust established by my grandfather over 40 years finally transferred into my name. I had everything: $15 million a legacy, and a husband who loved me so much, he tucked me in every single night. Back then, I called it love. Every night around 10, Julian would finish his work in the study and appear in the kitchen doorway, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, holding a small glass of water and 2 white capsules. He told me they were magnesium and vitamin D to help with my restless sleep. I had struggled with insomnia, but after taking them, I began to sleep through the night. I had no idea that the price of that deep sleep was my very existence. Julian Sterling was 34 and one of the most respected corporate attorneys in Western North Carolina. He was the kind of man who made a room feel more organized just by entering it. Handsome, controlled, and liked by everyone from my parents to longtime colleagues. Julian's likability was natural and effortless, much like a piece of high-end furniture designed so perfectly you don't notice the craft behind the comfort. We married 18 months after meeting in a beautiful ceremony at the estate. As he held my hands at the altar, I believed I had found the one thing everyone spends their life searching for. The night it all began, though, I didn't know it was a beginning, started like any other. Julian came home at 7, hung his jacket on the hook by the door, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and asked about my day. He was a wonderful listener, keeping his eyes on my face and asking follow-up questions. I used to tell people that he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. After dinner, he worked in his study while I read on the couch. Around 10, the familiar sound of his chair pushing back signaled he was done. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, with that warm, attentive husband smile. "Time for your vitamins, sweetheart." "Long day?" I asked, taking the glass. "Long enough," he replied, kissing my forehead as he watched me swallow the capsules. I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and climbed into the large bed with the pillows Julian had already arranged exactly how I liked them. The familiar heaviness settled in quickly. Within 20 minutes, the edges of the room went soft, my thoughts slowed, and my body sank into the mattress. I used to think it was the best sleep of my life. I know now it was the closest thing to not existing. It was the 3rd week of October. I remember the oak leaves turning amber outside the window and the specific weight of Julian's hand on my shoulder as he settled in beside me. Then I drifted away. Suddenly, I woke up at some point in the night. The room was pitch black, and my mind was thick and muffled by the drugs. I felt a weight at the edge of the bed. Opening my eyes, I saw Julian sitting there, silhouetted in the dark, staring down at my face. My heart lurched in my chest. Julian." My voice was thick, caught in the back of my throat. He smiled. In the darkness, I couldn't see his eyes or the true nature of that smile. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," he said, his voice perfectly gentle and calm. "You need your rest." I closed my eyes. A part of me wanted to ask why he was sitting there, why he was watching me in the dark, but the drugs pulled me under before I could finish the thought. I fell asleep again instantly, I didn't know it then, but the man sitting over me wasn't watching me out of love. He was checking the dosage. He was making sure I wouldn't wake up at the wrong time. He had been doing this every single night for 2 years. And all the while, I had been telling the world he was the most attentive husband I had ever known. The morning after Julian returned from his latest trip to Raleigh, a Tuesday in late October, 3 weeks before everything fell apart, I came downstairs to find Dorothy Harlan already at the kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes with the quiet efficiency she had brought to this house for 11 years. Dorothy was 61, a compact woman with silver hair. She kept pinned back, and hands that moved with the practiced economy of someone who had spent decades making other people's homes run without friction. She had worked for my grandmother first, then my mother, and when I moved into the estate after the trust transferred, she had simply stayed, not because I asked her to exactly, but because leaving would have felt wrong to both of us. The Miller estate without Dorothy was like a library without a librarian. Technically functional, fundamentally diminished. She didn't look up when I came in. That itself was unusual. Dorothy always looked up. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the counter and waited. She finished the last glass, dried her hands on the dish towel with 3 precise strokes, and then turned to face me. There was something in her expression I had not seen before, not fear exactly, but the look of a person who had been carrying something heavy and had finally decided to put it down. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, "I need to tell you something. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for a while now, and I've decided there's no good way, so I'm just going to say it." I set down my coffee mug. "Okay," I said. "Go ahead, Dorothy." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, something she almost never did during working hours. She folded her hands on the table the way a person does when they're trying to keep themselves steady. "Food has been going missing," she said. "Not a lot at once, but consistently. 3-4 times a week for I'd say about 8 months now, maybe longer. It started small enough that I thought I was miscounting. A portion of steak from the previous night's dinner, a carton of milk replaced before it should need replacing. Half a sleeve of crackers gone from a box I hadn't opened." She looked at me directly. "I keep detailed inventory, Mrs. Sterling. Your grandmother taught me that. So I know I'm not misremembering." I felt something shift slightly in my chest, not alarm, yet just attention. The kind of careful attention you give to something that doesn't fit. "Could it be—" I started. "I thought about everything," Dorothy said, cutting me off gently but firmly. "I thought about whether I was miscounting, whether Mr. Sterling was snacking at night and not mentioning it, whether there was something wrong with my inventory system. I went through every explanation." She paused, and then I started following the trail. "What trail?" She reached into the pocket of her apron and placed something on the table between us. A small plastic bag containing what looked absurdly like crumbs. Fine pale crumbs from crackers or bread, ground down fine. "3 weeks ago I found a path of these," she said, "starting at the kitchen, going down the hallway, up the stairs." She stopped. "They led to the built-in wardrobe in your bedroom, Mrs. Sterling. The one Mr. Sterling asked me when you first moved in never to clean. He said it was where he stored client files, confidential materials." Her voice was measured and precise. "I have respected that request for 3 years, but when I saw those crumbs leading to that wardrobe, I stood there for a long time and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know." She folded her hands tighter. "And I realized what I knew was this food doesn't walk itself down a hallway." The kitchen felt very quiet. Outside, the October wind was moving through the oak trees, and I could hear the faint sound of leaves against the window. I looked at the small bag of crumbs on the table and tried to make my brain work, properly tried to fit this into some framework that made sense. "Dorothy," I said carefully, "is there anything else?" She reached into her other apron pocket and set a second item on the table, a small brown paper bag folded shut. She opened it. Inside were several small objects, medical waste, I realized with a cold, slow recognition. 3 empty vials, the kind used for injectable medications. 2 torn open bandage wrappers of the type used for IV insertions or wound care. A single latex glove used and folded. "I found these in a separate trash bag," Dorothy said. "Not in any of the household bins, in a grocery bag that Mr. Sterling had set by the back door ready to carry out himself. He always carries out one particular bag himself. I noticed it about 6 months ago, but I told myself it was private papers perhaps, or something personal? She looked at me steadily. 2 weeks ago, the bag tipped over before he got to it and these fell out. I collected them before he came back. I picked up one of the vials. It was completely empty, the stopper still in place. I turned it in my fingers looking for a label, a pharmaceutical name, any indication of what it had contained. The label area was not blank. It had been scratched clean deliberately with something sharp. Every single vial was the same. Every single label gone. My hands were not shaking yet. I noted that with a distant sort of clinical interest, as if observing someone else's hands. Someone had been very careful about making sure no one could read what had been inside those vials. That level of care wasn't absent-mindedness. That level of care was intention. Dorothy was watching me with those steady, serious eyes. She said, "I have worked in this house for 11 years. I worked for your grandmother, and I worked for your mother, and now I work for you. I know what a two-person household looks like, Mrs. Sterling. I know what it eats, and what it wastes, and what it needs." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was very quiet but very clear. "What I've been seeing in this house, it isn't two people." I set the vial down on the table very carefully as if it were made of something fragile. The bag of crumbs sat beside it. Two small, ordinary-looking things that had somehow managed to crack the entire architecture of everything I thought I knew. I looked at Dorothy. My chest felt tight, my throat dry, my thoughts moving fast and sharp in a way that was entirely at odds with the stillness of my hands. "How long have you been carrying this?" I asked her. She exhaled slowly, and for just a moment the composure she had been holding so carefully let something else through. Something tired and worried and relieved all at once. "Long enough," she said. I didn't know who to tell. I didn't know if I was right. But I kept thinking, if I'm right and I say nothing. She stopped. I couldn't say nothing anymore, Mrs. Sterling. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She was trembling slightly, I realized. She had been trembling the whole time, and I hadn't noticed because she was holding herself so still. "You did the right thing," I told her. "You absolutely did the right thing." She nodded once, pressing her lips together hard. I could see her eyes going bright and glassy, threatening tears she was clearly too proud to shed in front of me, and she looked away out the window at the oak trees in the gray October morning. I looked back down at the scratched clean vials on my kitchen table. Someone in this house had been very careful about hiding what they contained, and the crumbs someone in this house had been eating crackers in the dark, making their way from the kitchen to a wardrobe that no one was allowed to clean. A wardrobe in my bedroom. I picked up the vial again and held it to the kitchen light. Empty. Label gone. Whatever had been inside was already administered, already, in someone's bloodstream, already doing whatever it had been designed to do. I thought about vitamins. The white capsules. The weight that settled over me every night was like a tide coming in. I picked up one of the sedative vials and turned it over in my fingers one more time. The label had been scratched off. Every single one of them. Someone had been very careful about making sure no one could read what was inside. Looking back, the rules were always there. I just called them something else. I called them preferences, quirks, the reasonable boundaries of a private man. I have spent a lot of time in the months since everything happened trying to understand how I missed them. Not in a self-punishing way. I have been told firmly by more than one person that I need to stop doing that, but in a genuine, analytical way. I was not a stupid woman. I had a year of law school, a grandmother who taught me to read contracts before I could drive, and a mother who raised me to ask questions. I was not naive. I was not meek. I was not the kind of woman who looked the other way. I was the kind of woman who trusted the man she loved. And Julian had spent 4 years making very sure I had every reason to. I met him at a charity auction at the Grove Park Inn when I was 22. He was in a dark suit, and he had just outbid someone on a weekend in the Blue Ridge, and he turned to the person beside him and said something that made them laugh, and I remember thinking, that is a man who knows exactly how rooms work. He was introduced to me an hour later. He remembered my name, precisely asked about my work. I was helping manage my family's charitable foundation at the time, and listened to the answer with the kind of focused attention that made you feel afterward like you had said something interesting. We had dinner 2 weeks later. We talked for 4 hours. He walked me to my car in the parking garage and shook my hand, and I drove home thinking about how strange it was that a handshake could feel more intimate than most kisses. On our third date, He brought me exactly the kind of flowers I had mentioned liking in passing on the first date. Not roses, but a loose bunch of garden flowers, the kind that looked like someone picked them rather than arranged them. I told my mother about it and she said, "Avery, that man pays attention." She said it like it was the highest possible compliment. I agreed with her completely. The rules started small. So small, I didn't see them as rules at all. Rule 1, the built-in wardrobe in what became our bedroom. Julian had moved into the estate 6 months after we married. It made practical sense the house was mine, and much larger than his apartment in downtown Asheville. In those first weeks of merging our lives and our furniture and our habits, he mentioned that he would need a secure space for client documents. Sensitive materials, he explained things that couldn't be left in the office because of their confidential nature. Attorney-client privilege. He said it with the practiced ease of someone explaining something so obvious it barely needed explaining. He would keep the wardrobe locked. He would manage its contents himself. Would I mind? I did not mind. I never thought to mind. Rule 2, the bedroom itself when Julian was traveling for work. He traveled often, 2-3 times a month, usually to Charlotte or Raleigh, occasionally to DC. Before a trip, he would spend what I assumed was an extra hour or two in his study working late. He would lock the bedroom door when he left. Not the deadbolt, just the simple knob lock that could be opened from the outside with a coin, but locked nonetheless. He mentioned it once early on when I came home to find it locked and called him to ask. "I had some documents spread out that I didn't want disturbed," he said. "The cleaning service was coming. I should have told you I'll leave you the key next time." He did leave me the key next time. I used it without thinking twice. Rule 3 was the subtlest and the one that, looking back, should have told me the most. Julian managed the household recycling. Not the regular trash, Dorothy handled that, but one specific bag, a grocery bag he kept in the mudroom, and carried out to the bin at the end of the driveway himself. When I asked him about it once early in our marriage, he laughed and said it was client-related documents shredded, and that he didn't want anyone else handling them out of an abundance of caution. I said, "Julian, you shred your own documents." He said old habits. I thought it was slightly eccentric and entirely harmless. I thought a lot of things were harmless. There were other small things. Julian preferred that I take my vitamins before coming to bed, rather than after, so that he explained the magnesium had time to start working while I was still upright. He preferred that the bedroom window be kept latched at night for security reasons. He preferred that we not have house guests stay in the bedroom wing, routing any overnight visitors to the guest rooms on the other side of the house. Each preference had a reason. Each reason was perfectly sensible. Taken separately, not one of them would have raised a flag in anyone's mind. That was the architecture of it. That was the thing I came to understand later, sitting in rooms with lawyers and detectives, and going through it all piece by piece. Julian had not built one large, suspicious structure. He had built dozens of small, ordinary-seeming ones, each with its own reasonable explanation, so that the whole thing looked from any angle exactly like the life of a careful, private, security-conscious attorney who loved his wife and ran a tight household. I have a very clear memory of the night I first heard the sound. It was winter, our first winter in the house together, and we had been in bed for perhaps an hour when I woke to something that at first I thought was the wind. A low, uneven sound, intermittent, coming from the direction of the wardrobe. I lay still and listened. It came again. Not wind. Something more textured than wind. Something with a rhythm that felt almost like breath. I sat up. Julian's hand found my arm in the dark immediately he had been awake. I realized lying there in the dark beside me, perfectly still. "What is it?" he said, and his voice was alert in a way that didn't match the drowsiness I would have expected. "I heard something," I said, "from the wardrobe." He was already sitting up, already moving toward the wardrobe side of the room. He pressed his ear to the wall beside it briefly, then turned back to me with an expression of comfortable reassurance. "Old houses settle," he said, coming back to bed, touching my cheek with 2 fingers. "The temperature drops at night and the wood contracts. I've heard it before, I should have warned you." He lay back down and drew me against his shoulder. "Go back to sleep, love. Old houses make strange sounds." I believed him. Of course I believed him. It was a reasonable explanation, and he offered it so easily, so naturally, without the slightest hesitation, and he was warm and certain beside me, and I was half asleep. I believed him, and I went back to sleep, and I did not think about it again for 3 more years. Old houses settle. I know that. Beams contract in the cold. Pipes knock in the walls. Floors shift under weight. I have lived in old houses my entire life, and I know their sounds. But what I heard that night was not a beam. It was not a pipe. And what I understand now, what I cannot unknow no matter how much some part of me wishes I could, is that on the other side of that wall, pressed up against it in the dark, there was a person. A person who had learned to keep very, very quiet. A person who, when she heard my voice say, I heard something, had stopped breathing entirely and waited with the practiced stillness of someone whose survival depended on not being found. She had heard everything. For 3 years she had heard everything. Old houses don't breathe. But she did. And that night she was trying very hard not to. Julian flew to Boston on Monday morning. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car disappear through the iron gates, and then I stood there a moment longer, coffee in hand, thinking about Dorothy's grocery bag of medical vials and the path of crumbs that led to a wardrobe I had never been allowed to open. I had not slept well. I had taken the vitamins. I was afraid, not too afraid, that any change in my routine would register somehow, but I had held them under my tongue until Julian was no longer watching, and then dropped them into the pocket of my robe. My sleep without them was thin and restless, full of half-formed thoughts that kept circling back to the same question: what is behind that wall? I decided, standing at the kitchen window that Monday morning, that I was going to find out. I called a painter named Silas Thorne. Silas had painted the sunroom 2 years earlier, a job I had arranged while Julian was in Charlotte, intending it as a surprise. He was a quiet man in his 60s with paint-stained hands and a long, careful way of looking at a room before he committed to any opinion about it. He had done good work. He answered his phone on the second ring. I'd like to have the main bedroom repainted, I told him. Julian's been talking about it for a while. I thought I'd surprise him while he's out of town. This was not entirely a lie. Julian had mentioned the paint once, months ago, in passing. The built-in wardrobe side of the room has some moisture coming through the wall. I'd like you to look at it. Treat the damp if it needs treating and repaint the whole room. Can you do Thursday? Silas said he could do Thursday. I want to be honest about what I was thinking, because I have told this story enough times now that I am in danger of making it sound more deliberate than it was. I did not hire Silas with the intention of having him find a hidden door. I did not plan what happened next. What I wanted, standing at that kitchen window, was to get into that room with a valid reason to move that wardrobe. I told myself I just needed to see the wall behind it. If there was nothing there, I would feel foolish and relieved. If there was something there, I hadn't let myself finish the thought. I had just picked up the phone. That is the best decision I ever made without fully understanding what I was making. Thursday morning, I let Silas in through the front door at 8. He had his equipment on a rolling cart and 2 cans of the warm white paint I had chosen. I walked him through the bedroom, explained the moisture concern on the wardrobe wall, and then I made coffee and waited downstairs, which is what I told myself I was doing. By 10:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, staring at the ceiling as if I could see through it when I heard Silas's voice from upstairs. Not calling out, not asking a question. Just my name in a tone I had never heard from him before. Mrs. Sterling. I was up the stairs before I had decided to move. The bedroom door was open. Silas was standing in the center of the room with his roller still in his hand, and he was looking at the wardrobe, at the space beside the wardrobe actually, with the expression of a man whose understanding of what kind of day he was having had just changed completely. The wardrobe was pushed 3 feet from the wall. It had taken Silas and his rolling equipment to shift it. It was solid oak, floor to ceiling, well over 300 pounds, and moving it to address the moisture damage had apparently required repositioning it from its original placement. In doing so, Silas had exposed the section of wall behind it. Or rather, the section of wall that was not in fact wall, fitted so precisely into the surrounding drywall that only the removal of the wardrobe could have revealed it. There was a door. A steel door set into a reinforced frame with a keypad lock and a single handlebar running across its face. It was the kind of door you put on a walk-in safe or a secure server room. It was the kind of door that cost several $1,000s and required professional installation. It was the kind of door that did not belong under any circumstances in a residential bedroom. and from behind it, faint, almost inaudible, the sound that Silas's rolling equipment shifting against the floor must have disturbed into existing came a sound. A human sound. Small, desperate, and immediately silenced. Silas turned to look at me. His face had gone a particular color, not pale exactly, but drained of its ordinary warmth, leaving something careful and frightened in its place. He looked at the door. He looked at me. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, and his voice was stripped of everything except the essential fact of what he was about to say. "I'm calling 911. "Yes," I said. My own voice sounded strange to me, distant as if I were hearing it from another room. "Yes, call right now." He had his phone out before I finished the sentence. I heard him give the address, the Miller Estate on the road out of Asheville. He said, "I need police, and I need an ambulance. I think there's someone behind a wall. I think someone is behind a wall." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and he pressed his lips together hard and kept talking steady, giving them every detail they asked for. I called Liam. He picked up on the first ring. "Something's in the bedroom wall," I said, and even as I said it, I understood how insane it sounded. "Behind the wardrobe, there's a steel door and there's someone behind it, Liam. Someone is behind the wall in my bedroom." A pause. Very short. Then, "Don't touch anything. Don't go near the door. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Silas finished with the dispatcher and stood with his phone in his hand, looking at the door. From behind the steel, there was silence now, a silence that felt intentional, the silence of something holding itself completely still. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom and looked at the door that had been there behind the wardrobe, behind the wall, behind the life. I thought I was living for how long? How long had it been installed? How long had Julian kept the wardrobe exactly in place, so that no one, not me, not Dorothy, not any service person would ever have a reason to move it? The Buncombe County Sheriff's response time to the Miller estate was 8 minutes. I know because I counted. Detective Karen Mercer arrived in the first unit, a woman in her early 40s with dark eyes and the particular quality of composure that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from years of practice at managing it. She took in the room in a single sweep, Silas against the far wall, the roller still in his hand, the moved wardrobe, the steel door. Then she looked at me. "Ma'am," she said, "I need you to step back, and I need you to tell me everything you know about this room." I looked at her steadily. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, but my hands still inexplicably, completely still. "That's the problem, Detective Nee," I said. "I don't know anything about this room. That's why I called." Something moved behind her eyes. She gave a short nod, turned to the 2 uniformed officers who had come in behind her, and said something in a low voice. They fanned out toward the door. Detective Mercer approached it herself, studied the keypad, tried the handle. Locked. She called for a locksmith and stood waiting, and while she waited, she looked at the steel door, and then looked at me, and I could see her processing it. The secured frame, the professional installation, the location of the door relative to the adjacent room. She was building a picture. I could almost see the lines of it forming behind her eyes. The locksmith was there in 20 minutes. The door took 11 minutes to open. Detective Mercer stepped through that steel door first. I stood in the doorway and watched her crouch down in the darkness inside, watched her flashlight sweep across I could not see what not yet, and heard her voice drop low and careful, the way you use your voice with something frightened. "Hey," she said. "Hey, it's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" Her name was Clara Vance. Detective Mercer told me that while we were standing in the hallway outside the bedroom, the paramedics still working inside the vault. She said it the way detectives deliver information factually, without ornament, watching my face for what the name produced. "She's been reported missing for 3 years, Mercer said. Her family filed the report in September of 2021. She was 27 years old at the time of her disappearance. We never found her." I said the name once out loud, quietly. Clara Vance. It meant nothing to me. I had never heard it before. And yet it had been behind my bedroom wall for 3 years, a human being with a name and a family and a life that had been interrupted so completely that the state of North Carolina had long since filed her away under cases that did not close. One of the paramedics came out to retrieve something from the equipment bag in the hallway, and I looked past him through the steel door that was now standing fully open into the vault. The lighting inside was harsh. The paramedics had set up portable work lights that flooded everything in a flat, unforgiving white. And in that light, I could see for the first time the room that Julian had built behind my bedroom wall. It was not large, perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The walls were bare concrete painted gray. At some point, the paint now stained and marked with what I could see from here were hundreds of small scratched lines arranged in groups of 5, the universal language of people counting days. A cot against one wall, military, narrow with a thin blanket folded at its foot. A chemical toilet behind a partial screen. And running down the center of the space, taking up more than half its width, a row of computer monitors, 6 of them connected to a server rack that ran floor to ceiling along the back wall. The monitors were still active. Numbers and account strings scrolled across 3 of them. A 4th displayed what looked like a banking interface I did not recognize. The equipment was not old. Some of it looked nearly new. Clara Vance was on the cot when the paramedics found her. She was now on a stretcher, and as they began to move her toward the door, I got my first clear look at her. She was thin in a way that made my chest physically ache. The kind of thin that doesn't happen quickly. That is the result of a long time of not enough. A body that has been running on insufficient resources for so long, it has restructured itself around the deficit. Her hair was dark and had been cut at some point with something that was not scissors, or not sharp scissors jagged at the ends. Her skin was the color of something that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. But it was her eyes that stopped me completely. She was looking at me. Not at the paramedics, not at Mercer, not at the ceiling the way people who have been through severe trauma sometimes look at ceilings. At me. She was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately name. Recognition, I realized after a moment. She knew exactly who I was. Her ankle, as they moved her past me, briefly came into view from beneath the thin hospital blanket the paramedics had placed over her. There was a deep, discolored band of scar tissue around it, the kind left by long-term restraint, a mark that had healed and retorn and healed again, leaving a permanent record of the chain that had held her to that desk. "Wait," I said. The paramedics paused. Clara looked at me. Up close, her face was sharp-featured and exhausted. Her lips cracked her eyes, holding a particular quality of alertness. Watchfulness, I thought, the alertness of someone who had been listening hard for 3 years. "I'm Avery," I said, because I didn't know what else to say, because she already knew who I was, and saying my name was the only thing I could offer. I live in this house. I didn't know. I want you to know, I didn't know." Her mouth moved. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse in the way of someone who has gone long periods without speaking, unused, a little rough at the edges but still entirely there. "I know," she said. Her eyes were very steady on mine. "He made sure you wouldn't." The paramedics moved her through the door. I pressed myself against the hallway wall to let them pass, and then I stood there for a moment, not quite able to move my back against the wallpaper, looking at the empty doorway. Detective Mercer appeared beside me. "We're going to need a full statement from you," she said. "But not right now. Right now, I need you to not touch anything in that room. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. She went back inside. I waited until she was occupied with one of the officers, and then I stepped into the vault myself. Standing inside it was different from looking at it from the doorway. Inside, the smell hit first disinfectant layered over something organic, and closed the smell of a space where someone had lived and eaten and slept and been afraid for a very long time. The ceiling was low enough that I had to drop my chin slightly. The cot was unmade now from where Clara had been on it, the thin pillow bearing the imprint of her head, and something about that small indentation made my eyes sting sharply. I looked at the monitors. They were still running. Account strings scrolled across the screens, and even to my untrained eye, I could see the pattern of what they represented: multiple accounts. Complex routing structures, the kind of layered financial architecture that exists for one reason. I looked at the server rack. I looked at the desk, which had a bracket bolted into the floor in front of it, a short length of heavy chain still attached to it, the end of the chain a couple of feet long and terminating in a cuff with a locking mechanism. She had been chained to that desk. I turned to find Clara standing, no, sitting against the cot's headboard. She had asked the paramedics to wait, had said something quiet and firm that made them step back, and now she was looking at the wall that ran between this room and the main bedroom. the wall with the corkboard screwed into it at head height. I followed her gaze. The corkboard was covered in papers, printed financial documents, account numbers, routing codes. Several printed photographs of my hands went cold of me. Photographs of me sleeping, taken from above my face slack, and empty, my eyes open. In the photographs, my eyes were open. "He built it so the sound only travels one way," Clara said. She was still looking at the wall, not at me. Her voice was quiet, precise, controlled in the manner of someone who has had a very long time to decide what they will say when this moment comes. I could hear everything that happened in that room. Every conversation. Every sound. She stopped. "He put me here on purpose. He wanted me to hear." My throat was so tight I could not answer immediately. I thought about every conversation Julian and I had ever had in that bedroom. Every whispered, ordinary thing. Every tender moment I thought was private. She had heard all of it. 3 years of it. 8 feet away. The paramedic put a careful hand on Clara's shoulder and said they really did need to go. She let them help her stand, accepted the arm they offered, and walked toward the door with the careful, cautious gait of someone who has spent a long time in a small space and is relearning in real time what it means to move through a larger one. At the door, she stopped and looked back at me one final time. "He used the computers for money," she said. "Your money. He told me if I stopped or if I made noise, he would kill you and say it was me." She said it without tears, without dramatics, simply as a statement of documented fact. I believed him, so I stayed quiet. Then she was gone down the hallway and out of my sight, and I was alone in the vault. I stood there and looked at the monitors still running, the accounts, still moving, the photographs of my own open, empty eyes pinned to the corkboard. Julian had built himself a prison inside my home. He had put a woman in it and given her my financial accounts to manage and put my sleeping face on the wall in front of her desk. And I had slept 8 feet away from it for 3 years without ever knowing. I didn't speak to Clara properly until Wednesday morning. The hospital had needed Tuesday evening and all of Tuesday night to do what hospitals do. Labs, imaging, IV fluids, the quiet, systematic work of assessing a body that had been significantly neglected and assigning a medical language to what had been done to it. Detective Mercer had taken her official statement in the early hours of Wednesday with a victim advocate present, and then the doctors had given her 4 more hours of uninterrupted rest before they would permit anything else. I called ahead. A nurse told me she could have 20 minutes. I brought coffee 2 cups black because I didn't know how she took it, and I didn't want to assume anything about her preferences, not even something as small as that. She was sitting up in bed when I walked in. The IV was still in her arm. She had been given a hospital gown and clean socks, and someone had managed to brush her hair, which was tucked behind her ears. In the flat white light of the hospital room, she looked both older and younger than I expected, older in her eyes, which had that particular depth that comes from having seen things that cannot be unseen, and younger in her face, which was still girlish beneath the gauntness, fine-featured in a way that the malnutrition had made angular rather than erased. She looked at me when I came in, the way she had looked at me in the vault, carefully measuring something, deciding something. Then she nodded once as if I had passed some test she had been administering silently. "You brought coffee," she said. "I didn't know how you took it." "Black is fine." She accepted the cup with both hands the way someone does when they want to feel the warmth of a thing as much as drink it, and held it for a moment without drinking. "Sit down," she said. "There's a lot." I sat in the chair beside her bed. Detective Mercer had informed me she would be taking her own notes on anything Clara shared with me voluntarily. This was, she explained, Clara's choice, and Clara had said she wanted Avery present. I was trying not to think too hard about what it meant that a woman who had been imprisoned in my house for 3 years wanted me in the room while she talked about it. Clara drank her coffee slowly, looking at the window, a rectangle of gray November sky, pale and flat. Then she began to talk. Her voice was still rough at the edges but steady. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed something for a very long time, not because they plan to deliver it as a speech, but because going over it in their head was the only thing they had to do for 3 years. She had worked for Julian as a paralegal at his firm, she said. Highly paid, highly trusted, which was why he had brought her in on the accounts. Not the firm's accounts, the other accounts, the ones that existed in names she began to recognize over months of quiet observation as names that did not belong to real people. Shell companies, entities that existed on paper, registered in states with minimal disclosure requirements, each one holding money that arrived from somewhere Julian never explained and needed to move somewhere else quickly and cleanly. I should have walked away the first time he showed me, Clara said flatly. I know that. I've had a lot of time to know that. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. But I didn't. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Then it was another one-time thing. And by the time I understood what I was actually inside of, he understood what I knew. She found the full scope of it by accident. A misfiled document she wasn't supposed to see, a set of routing codes that connected two accounts she had believed were unrelated. She had gone to Julian intending to ask him what the filing meant. She had not understood walking into his office that day, that asking the question was going to end her life as she knew it. He was very calm about it, she said. That was the most frightening thing. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten me the way you expect someone to threaten you. He just explained very quietly what my options were. Her jaw tightened. One option was the vault. The other option was that the evidence he had already prepared documentation that put my name on all of it, all the accounts, all the transfers dating back 2 years would go to the DA's office, along with a statement from him that he had discovered the fraud and come to him terrified of my superiors. She looked at me directly. He had been building that second option since before I ever touched the first account. He needed someone whose name and credentials could stand on the documents. He chose me because he already had leverage on my background, a sealed expungement from when I was 19 that he had found and kept. He had been planning this long before he gave me access to anything. I felt sick. The coffee cup in my hands was warm, but my fingers had gone cold. Julian had not stumbled into using Clara as a cover. He had recruited her. He had positioned her. He had built the trap before she walked into it. He told me I would work, Clara continued, from the vault. He said my skills were too useful to waste and too dangerous to leave free. What you saw in that room, the equipment, the racks, the monitors, he assembled all of it at night, piece by piece over 3 weeks, while I lay in the dark on that cot and listened to him carry things through the house. I didn't know what was being built around me. What I know now is that before he ever set foot in a law school classroom, he spent 2 years studying network architecture. He didn't hire anyone to install it. He built every part of it himself, which meant there were no contractors, no technicians, no outside eyes, no one alive who knew that room existed except the man who built it and the woman he put inside it. She paused. I worked 18 hours a day for the first year. Less after that when he had what he needed set up, but still he needed me functional. So he kept me functional. She said it without anger. That was the thing that undid me, not the content of what she was describing, which was monstrous, but the flatness of her voice. She had moved through the emotion of this material so many times alone in that room that she had come out the other side of it into something drier and more terrible than anger. There's something else, she said, about you specifically. She described it carefully. Julian had begun approximately 2 years ago, making what she called visits to the bedroom after she could hear from her side of the wall that Avery had gone fully under. He would enter the bedroom, she said, and he would stay for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. She heard the particular sounds of it, the soft clicks of equipment, a mechanical hum she had eventually identified as a biometric scanner. She had seen the results on the monitor one morning when he left a file open photographs. Her eyes open, pupils fixed unseeing, fingerprints being captured from a relaxed hand. He photographed it every time, Clara said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Your eyes were open in every image. But you weren't there, Avery. Whatever was in those vitamins put you somewhere else. And while you were there, he was using your body as a key. The room felt very small. I was gripping the coffee cup so hard my knuckles had gone white, and I made myself loosen my fingers one by one, made myself breathe. How much? I asked her. How much did he take? Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the window again. From the accounts I processed directly, a little over $4 million, she said. But that's only what went through me. He had other structures I only partially saw, accounts I routed to, but didn't originate entities that existed upstream of everything I touched. She turned back to me. I don't know the full number. I just know the part of it that has my name on it. And I know that if this ever went to court exactly as Julian built it, every document, every transaction, every signature, I would be the criminal. He would be the man who discovered the fraud and reported it. That was always the plan. I set the coffee cup down on the bedside table very carefully because my hands were no longer entirely steady. $4 million. Biometric data collected while I was unconscious. A paper trail built for years designed to collapse onto a woman Julian had imprisoned in a concrete room, pointing every finger of every document in her direction and none of them toward him. He had built this so perfectly that even the evidence of his crimes was the evidence of someone else's. The hospital parking lot was cold. I stood beside my car with my phone in my hand and the November wind cutting across the asphalt, and I thought about what Clara had just told me. $4 million. Biometric scans. A paper trail that pointed entirely at her. Julian had been building this before we were married. He had chosen me. I was beginning to understand, not despite the trust fund, but because of it, and he had built every piece of his infrastructure with the patience of someone who understood that the best traps are the ones that take years to set. I called Liam Whitaker. Liam and I had met at UNC's law school orientation when we were both 19 years old, equally terrified of the same property law professor, and equally underprepared for the reading load. He had become a criminal defense attorney. I had dropped out after a year, deciding that managing the Miller Family Foundation was both more interesting and more honest than anything I had seen in those lecture halls. We had stayed close anyway, the kind of close that survives long stretches without contact that picks back up immediately and exactly where it left off. 2 years ago, over dinner at a restaurant in downtown Asheville, Liam had looked across the table at Julian, and then looked at me and said quietly when Julian went to the bathroom, "He makes me uncomfortable, and I can't tell you why. There's nothing specific. He's just, I can't see the edges of him, Avery. Does that make sense?" I had laughed it off. I had told him he was being paranoid. I had told him Julian was the most straightforward man I had ever known. He picked up on the first ring. "I need you," I said. "Right now. Not tomorrow. Right now. Tell me." I told him. Standing in the parking lot, pacing the length of my car, I told him everything from the medical vials in Dorothy's apron pocket to the steel door, to Clara Vance sitting in a hospital bed describing 18 hours a day at a chained desk, to the photographs of my own eyes open and empty and the number 4 million. I talked for 12 minutes without stopping, and Liam listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued most about him. When I finished, there was a pause, not long, 3 or 4 seconds, while he processed it. "Are you in your car?" he asked. "Parking lot? Drive to my office. Don't go home yet. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Then, "Avery, are you okay?" "I don't know what that means right now," I said. "Fair enough. Drive to my office." His office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue, a 15-minute drive from the hospital. By the time I got there, he was already at his desk with 2 legal pads out, 1 pen behind his ear, and another in his hand, his jacket off. He stood when I came in, looked at me for a moment with the appraising concern of a person who is cataloging your condition, and then said, "Sit down and start from the beginning. I need everything in order." I told him again this time, more slowly, more completely, beginning with the night I first heard the sound in the wall. He wrote continuously. He asked questions that cut to exactly the right things. When did the trust transfer? In whose name is the deed to the estate? Has Julian ever had independent access to your financial accounts? What is the name of the firm where Clara worked? His pen moved fast and clean across the legal pad. When I finished the second telling, he sat back and looked at what he had written. His expression was the particular expression of a lawyer looking at a problem that is both serious and, I could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, solvable. "Detective Mercer already has a case," he said. "Unlawful imprisonment is going to be the easiest count because the physical evidence is unambiguous. A locked vault, a woman in chains, 41 months of scratch marks on a concrete wall. Julian will be arrested for that alone as soon as she files the charges, which she will do today or tomorrow." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem," Liam said, "is that Julian Sterling is a corporate attorney with 15 years of experience and a working knowledge of exactly how bail hearings function in Buncombe County. He will be arrested, he will appear before a magistrate within 24 hours, and he will have the best criminal defense attorney in Charlotte on the phone before the ink is dry on his booking sheet. Unlawful imprisonment at the felony level is serious, but it's arguable. His lawyer will argue that the vault was a consented arrangement, that Clara was a business partner involved in financial crimes, that the chain was for security purposes related to sensitive data. It sounds insane. It will sound less insane to a bail magistrate at 7 in the morning with 40 cases before him. He paused. If Julian gets bail on just the imprisonment charge, he destroys every piece of evidence in that house before we can build the rest of the case. I leaned forward. So what do? We build the rest of the case first, Liam said. The biometric fraud, the financial structure, the insurance policy, if there is one, and Avery, given everything else I am hearing, I would bet my license there is one. We give Detective Mercer the full picture. We give her something that makes bail impossible. He looked at me steadily. We need the attempted murder charge. We need him caught doing something that no bail magistrate in North Carolina will look at and call arguable. We need him in the act. I felt the cold thing in my chest. The thing that had been sitting there since Tuesday rearrange itself into something harder and more purposeful. Then we wait for him to try, I said. Yes. Liam held my gaze. And you go home tonight and you act like none of this happened. Julian's flight from Boston landed at 6. I knew because I checked the airline app automatically the same way I had checked it 100 times over 4 years, out of habit, out of the reflex of a wife who tracks her husband's schedule. I stared at the notification for a moment. Flight landed on time, baggage claim in 15 minutes. I drove home. I turned onto the private road and watched the iron gates of the Miller estate open in front of me, and I thought the last time I drove through these gates, I did not know what my house was. Now I do. Everything about me has to look exactly the same. My face, my voice, the way I set his bourbon on the counter, the way I smile when he comes through the door. Nothing can change. I pulled into the garage. I turned off the engine. I sat for a moment in the dark with my hands in my lap. Then I got out of the car and went inside to wait for my husband. He kissed me on the cheek when he walked in. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine I had poured 10 minutes earlier and not touched, and when the door from the garage opened and Julian came through it, I turned and smiled and said, "Hey, you're back," as if those were just words and not the most precisely constructed 4 syllables of my life. He kissed my cheek. He dropped his bag by the stairs. He smelled like the inside of a business-class cabin, recycled air and the faint trace of the cologne he always wore. And he looked as he always looked after, a few days away, slightly tired and slightly pleased to be home. He looked, I thought, completely ordinary. "Good flight?" I asked. "Delayed out of Logan by an hour, but not bad." He opened the refrigerator, scanned it, pulled out the bourbon instead, and went to the counter. "How was your week?" "My week?" I had found a woman chained behind our bedroom wall. I had stood in a concrete room and counted 41 months of scratch marks. I had sat in a hospital room while that woman described how my husband had been scanning my unconscious eyes and fingerprints for 2 years to drain my inheritance. I had driven to my attorney's office and made a plan to catch my husband committing murder. "Quiet," I said. "Dorothy made that soup I like. I had lunch with a girlfriend on Wednesday." Julian poured 2 fingers of bourbon and looked at me over the rim of the glass. He was listening. He was always listening. I had once loved that about him, the quality of his attention, and now the feeling it produced in me was something much closer to nausea. "You seem tired," he said. I didn't sleep that well last night." This was true. I had not taken the vitamins. I had held them under my tongue as I had been doing since Monday, and I was sleeping badly and thinking too clearly, and both of those things were necessary. He put down the glass and came around the island and put both hands on my shoulders, a familiar gesture, something he had done 1,000 times before. This time, my entire nervous system registered it as threat. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I held his gaze. "Let's have dinner," he said. "I'll cook." Julian cooked when he was in a particular mood, not often, but occasionally, and always the same 3 dishes done very well. Tonight, he made pasta with a sauce that took 40 minutes and filled the kitchen with the smell of garlic and white wine. He talked about Boston, a deposition that had gone well, a dinner with a client who was considering expanding the firm's retainer. I sat at the kitchen island and asked follow-up questions in the right places and laughed at the one thing that warranted a laugh. My hands did not shake. I have thought about that many times since. how completely still my hands were. I think it was because I had crossed some line that evening in the parking garage. I had stopped being a woman in shock and started being a woman with a plan, and on the other side of that line, emotion became something you used rather than something that used you. After dinner, Julian stood at the sink rinsing the plates with the methodical efficiency he brought to every domestic task. "Vitamins," he said without looking up. I had prepared for this. I had thought about it since Liam's office. I could not stop taking them. Any change in routine might register. I went to the cabinet myself this time. He didn't come to me the way he usually did. He stayed across the kitchen, watching from a distance, the glass of water already poured on the counter waiting. I shook the capsules into my palm. The small sound of the bottle rattling was the loudest thing in the room. I put them on my tongue. I picked up the glass. I drank. I showed him the empty glass without being asked because he was already looking, and I set it down on the counter with the careful steadiness of someone who had done this 1,000 times and meant it every single one. He watched me set the glass down. A beat of silence crossed the kitchen. Not comfortable silence, but the particular silence of two people performing normalcy, and both knowing it. Then he crossed the room and touched my face briefly with the backs of his fingers, the same gesture he had used 1,000 times before. "Go on up," he said. "I'll be right behind you." "Of course," I said. And I smiled at him. I went upstairs. I went into the bathroom. I ran the water and spit the capsules into my hand and held them under the tap and watched the gel coating dissolve before I put them in the toilet and flushed them. Then I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, at my own face, which was the same face it had always been, and at my own eyes, which were focused and present and entirely my own. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and waited. Julian came up 40 minutes later. I heard him shower change, move quietly around the room with the ease of a man who believes his household is exactly as he arranged it. He got into bed. He was still for a while. I kept my breathing slow, and even the particular rhythm of deep sleep I had been unconsciously performing for 2 years without knowing I was performing it now, done with complete deliberate intention. After perhaps 30 minutes, I heard him move. The careful shift of weight, the controlled easing out of the mattress so as not to create disturbance. The soft footsteps toward the wardrobe side of the room. A sound I could now identify as the keypad being entered, 5 digits, a soft confirmation tone, and the mechanical release of the steel door. He was in there for 23 minutes. I know because I counted everyone lying in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I could not hear what happened inside. The vault was designed for exactly that, but I knew what he found, and I knew what that meant. The space was empty. Clara was in the hospital, the servers were still running, and Julian was standing in his vault at 11 at night, finding that his prisoner was gone. He came back out. The door sealed. He came back to bed. He settled in beside me, and I felt the quality of his stillness change. It was no longer the stillness of someone who had done a routine thing and returned to rest. It was the stillness of someone calculating. He reached over and smoothed my hair back from my face. Gently. With great care. "Sleep well, sweetheart," he said. I kept my eyes closed. I kept my breathing even. I counted 9 days on his calendar. 3 of mine. Before I tell you what Liam found inside that insurance policy, the document that made my blood run cold and my hands stop shaking only because I had no more room left for shock, I need to know you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just the number. That's all I need to know you're here, because what comes next is the part that will make you question everything you think you know about the person sleeping next to you. Liam called me at 7 Thursday morning. I was already awake. I had been awake since 3, lying in the dark beside Julian and listening to him breathe with the particular controlled evenness of someone who was not sleeping either. "I found it," Liam said. "Avery, I found all of it." I got out of bed carefully, took my phone into the bathroom, and ran the shower so the sound of water would cover my voice. "Tell me," I said. "Get dressed. Come to my office. You need to see this in person." Julian was still in bed when I came out of the bathroom, or appeared to be. I dressed quietly, told him I had an early errand, kissed his cheek the way I had kissed it 100,000 times. He made a small sound that could have been acknowledgement and could have been the sound a man makes when he is performing sleep. I did not look back on my way out of the room. Liam's office was laid out differently than it had been 2 days ago. The legal pads had been replaced by printed documents organized into 4 distinct stacks across his conference table, each stack with a yellow, sticky note identifying its contents. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at those 4 stacks and understood before he said a word that whatever was in them was worse than what I had already been told. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He started with the first stack. A life insurance policy, Julian Sterling policyholder. Avery Miller Sterling insured party. Benefit amount $15 million. Taken out 14 months ago, paid in full quarterly through a brokerage that Liam had traced to a holding company in Delaware that did not appear in any of Julian's publicly filed financial disclosures. Concealed, in other words. Deliberately hidden from any routine financial review. He paid the premiums from a personal account Clara had no access to, Liam said. This was separate from the financial structure Clara was managing. Julian kept this completely firewalled. I looked at the policy document. My name printed in clean institutional type. $15 million. The number had its own particular weight when you saw it applied to your own life, to the value in someone else's calculation of your death. The second stack was harder. Liam placed it in front of me with the careful deliberateness of a doctor delivering a diagnosis he has been preparing for. A medical file, he explained, created in my name 18 months ago at a psychiatric practice in Hendersonville, 40 minutes from Asheville. The practice was real. The psychiatrist who signed the documents was real. But the assessment's 6 sessions detailed clinical notes, a formal diagnosis of major depressive disorder with suicidal ideation, were fabricated. The psychiatrist, Liam told me flatly, had been found in the financial records. Julian had paid him $40,000 over 8 months. The clinical language is specific, Liam said. It describes escalating suicidal thoughts, a fixation on self-harm, as a means of ending psychological suffering, previous attempts. It creates a documented history of someone who, if they were found dead, would represent a tragic but not entirely surprising outcome. I put both hands flat on the table. My chest felt like something was sitting on it. "When?" I said. Liam moved to the third stack. A document I recognized, my own will drawn up by my family's estate attorney 2 years ago, reviewed and signed by me at his office with a notary present. I knew what was in it. I had written what was in it. My estate to a list of charitable foundations. My grandmother had supported a provision for Dorothy, a scholarship fund at the university. The version in Liam's third stack was not that document. It was the same format, the same template, the same paper. But the beneficiary had been changed. The entire estate, the trust, the property, every asset to Julian Matthew Sterling as sole heir. And my signature at the bottom in my own handwriting, except I had never signed it. Forensic document examination will confirm the forgery, Liam said. The signature was traced from an authenticated document. You can see the slight variations in pressure and angle that indicate mechanical reproduction, rather than natural motion. But it is a very good forgery, done by someone with access to multiple examples of your genuine signature and the patience to practice. He paused. This is a separate criminal charge, forgery of a legal document, Class 1 felony in North Carolina. The fourth stack was the smallest, a printed calendar. Personal, hand-annotated, the kind someone keeps on their phone or desk. 3 months, October through December. Most of the dates were blank, but one date in December was marked with a single notation. My birthday, 26th birthday, the day I would turn 26 years old. Next to the date, in Julian's neat, precise handwriting, the word arranged. Liam watched my face as I read it. He said very quietly, "The trust fund fully transferred into your sole name 6 months ago. Julian is your sole beneficiary under the forged will. The life insurance pays out on death by suicide. In fact, it pays a higher benefit for self-inflicted death because of a rider," he added. The psychiatric file documents a history of suicidal ideation, and the date he has written on that calendar is 4 days before Christmas, I said, when my family would expect me to be visiting them in Charlotte, when I would be expected to have traveled, when an absence of several days before discovery would be unremarkable. Yes, I sat with that for a moment. I sat with the understanding that Julian had calculated not just my death, but the logistics of it, the window of time, the plausibility, the paper that would explain it. He had built a story around an ending, and he had been building it for over a year, adding layers with the methodical patience of a man who never moved to the next step until the previous one was perfectly in place. 9 days, I said. 9 days. Liam confirmed. But here is the thing, Avery. He has made a mistake. He gave himself a fixed date, which means he gave us a fixed target, and he does not know that we know about the date. He does not know that we know about any of it. Liam leaned forward, elbows on the table. We have 9 days to build a case that makes what happens on that date the last thing he ever plans. Then we use every single one of them, I said. I drove home in the gray Thursday morning with my eyes on the road and my mind running very fast and very clean, the way your mind runs when fear has finished with you, and what's left is pure focus. 9 days on his calendar. 9 days in which Julian Sterling believed he was the only person who knew what was coming. He was wrong about that, and I intended, before those 9 days were done, to make sure he understood exactly how wrong. Nate Cross arrived at Liam's office at noon on Thursday with a canvas duffel bag, a stainless steel thermos of what turned out to be very strong black coffee, and the expression of a man who approached other people's worst days the way a structural engineer approaches a damaged bridge, not with distress, but with the focused, methodical attention of someone who knows that emotion is not a tool, and tools are what's needed. Liam introduced us in the conference room. Nate was 38, lean with close-cropped hair and the kind of eyes that moved around a room cataloging things before they settled on you. He had spent 8 years with the Army's Cyber Operations Division before going private, and his firm, a 4-person outfit operating out of Charlotte, specialized in digital forensics and counter-surveillance. Liam had worked with him on 2 previous cases involving financial fraud. I pulled the public IP address of the servers in the vault last night, Nate said before I had finished sitting down. He opened his laptop. The system is still active. Julian hasn't touched it remotely, which tells us he doesn't know we're in the house, or he's deliberately leaving it running to avoid triggering any alerts on the financial end. Either way, the servers are broadcasting. He turned the laptop to face me. I've been pulling the log files for the past 6 hours. Detective Mercer was in the chair at the end of the table. She had arrived 10 minutes before me, Liam told me, with a legal notepad and the information that the Buncombe County DA's office had been briefed and was monitoring the situation. She was here, she said, in a formal capacity. Anything discussed in this room could be used in the warrant application she was already drafting. Nate walked us through what the log files showed with the efficiency of someone who had clearly presented complex technical information to non-technical audiences many times. The servers in the vault had been running continuously for approximately 36 months. During that time, they had processed transactions through 42 separate shell company accounts entities registered in Delaware, Wyoming, and South Dakota jurisdictions, chosen for their minimal disclosure requirements. The total volume of funds moved was significantly larger than the $4 million Clara had described as going through the accounts she directly managed. She was only seeing part of the picture, Nate said. She handled the outbound, routing the money leaving the system. Julian managed the inbound side himself. We're looking at a total transaction volume of approximately $11 million over 3 years, of which roughly $4 million is traceable directly to Avery's trust fund accounts. Mercer wrote something on her pad without looking up. There's something else, Nate said. He opened a different folder on his laptop. The biometric data. He had found it in a directory that Julian had labeled with either contemptible arrogance or clinical detachment, simply verification. Inside were 312 files, each date stamped each, containing the same 2 elements, a high-resolution retinal scan image and a fingerprint capture. The files spanned 26 months. He turned the laptop toward me again. The photograph filled the screen. I was lying on my back in my own bed. The image had been taken from above at close range with a high-quality camera. My eyes were open. My face was completely slack, not the relaxed face of sleep, but the vacant face of full sedation, of a body present and a consciousness entirely absent. My pupils were fixed, neither dilated nor contracted, simply stopped. I had been told what these photographs contained. Seeing one was different from being told about it. My throat closed. My eyes stung hard and sudden, the way they do when you've been holding something back, and something small and specific breaks your grip on it. I pressed my lips together and looked at the corner of the room for a moment until I was sure I was not going to cry in front of people I needed to think of me as functional. "This is prosecutable," Mercer said, and her voice was flat and certain, as identity theft under North Carolina General Statute 14-113.20. Combined with the financial fraud and the forged will, we have more than enough for the warrant on those charges. She looked at Nate, then at Liam, then at me. But what we have is not enough for attempted murder. Not yet. For that charge to stick, we need him in the act. We need the physical evidence of an attempt, not just the planning of one. "Which means we let him think he still has 9 days, Liam said. "Which means we let him think he still has 9 days, she confirmed. I looked at Nate. "The cameras," I said. "You mentioned a system using a milk carton." Nate nodded. "A micro camera in a standard milk carton housing. Wireless motion-activated, transmits to an encrypted channel I can monitor remotely. Paired with a thermal imaging sensor mounted outside the house, that one requires a warrant which Detective Mercer has already applied for." He looked at me. "Someone who lives in the house needs to place the milk carton in the refrigerator. The outside unit I can mount on the property line myself legally." "I'll put it in the refrigerator," I said. "Julian leaves for the office at 8:30 tomorrow morning. I'll have it in place by 9. Mercer nodded once. Liam made a note. There was a brief silence while Nate opened a third set of files. Then he said, "There's one more element that would significantly strengthen the attempted murder case. The vault servers. If Julian goes in and uses the system, we capture his direct action on the financial crime in real time, and we capture him accessing a space where a victim is present. That combination is very difficult to defend against." He paused. "Which means, ideally, someone needs to be in that vault when he goes in." Nobody said anything for a long moment. The conference room was quiet. Outside Liam's window, Asheville was doing the ordinary things a city does on a Thursday afternoon: cars moving on Lexington Avenue, someone laughing on the sidewalk below, the sound of a delivery truck. Ordinary sounds. The sound of a world that had no idea what was being arranged in this second-floor office. The voice came from the doorway. What none of us had considered was that when Detective Mercer had taken Clara's statement at the hospital that morning, Clara had asked quietly, directly, in the manner of someone who had spent 3 years learning to extract information, without drawing attention to the asking where the planning meeting was being held. Mercer had told her, intending it as a courtesy, rather than an invitation. Clara had asked the hospital's discharge coordinator to call a cab to the address on Lexington Avenue. She had arrived apparently 6 minutes before I did, and she had been standing in the hallway long enough to hear the last part of what Nate had said. None of us had heard the door open. None of us had heard footsteps in the hall. But Clara Vance was standing in the doorway of Liam's conference room in a borrowed coat and hospital-issue socks. Her discharge paperwork folded in one hand, and she was looking at Nate's laptop screen with an expression that told me she had heard at least the last part of what he had said. "I'll go back," she said. No hesitation, no trembling. Just 3 words. The room had gone very still. Liam was the first to move. He stood up from his chair, not quickly, but with the careful deliberateness of a person who is choosing not to react to something the way their nervous system wants them to. Mercer set her pen down. Nate looked at Clara with an expression that was professionally neutral and humanly troubled in equal measure. I looked at her. She was standing in the doorway in Dr. Patricia Owen's borrowed gray cardigan. Dr. Owen was Liam's colleague, the physician who had arranged Clara's discharge paperwork, and the private blood workup that was now part of the evidence file, with the discharge paper in one hand, and the particular quality of stillness she carried, the stillness of someone who had made their decision before they walked through the door. "Clara," I said. "I heard what you need," she said. She stepped fully into the room and pulled out the chair beside mine and sat down without being invited, which was exactly what I would have done, and which made something sharp and unexpected catch in my chest. "You need someone in the vault when he goes in. Someone who can confirm that he entered with intent, and that what he brought with him constituted an attempt." She looked at Mercer directly. "I know how he works. I know what he sounds like when he's doing what he does. I know his habits and his timelines. No one else in this room knows those things." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "Ms. Vance," she said. "You were discharged from the hospital this morning. You have been through—" "I know what I've been through," Clara said. Her voice was not sharp. It was simply final. the voice of someone who has moved past the stage where other people's assessments of their condition are relevant. I've had 3 years to know exactly what I've been through, and I've had 3 years to think about what comes after. She looked at her own hands, which were folded on the table, thin, slightly trembling, but folded. If you go in without me in place, and he goes to the vault and finds it empty, he runs. He has money and structures that haven't been traced yet. He has a valid passport and 48 hours of confusion before anyone starts a serious search. She looked at Mercer again. You know I'm right. Mercer said nothing for a moment. Then she opened her notepad and uncapped her pen. If I agree to this, she said, it is conditional. You will have a medical professional present during all preparation. You will be equipped with a panic device that transmits directly to my radio any trigger, any indication that your safety is compromised, and we move immediately, case be damned. You have the absolute right to withdraw at any point before or during. She paused. And I mean any point, Ms. Vance. You say, stop, we stop. Clara nodded. Those are acceptable conditions. One more thing, Mercer said. She held Clara's gaze without softening it. You understand that your testimony and the circumstances of your return to that space will be scrutinized by a defense attorney whose job is to make everything you say look coerced or compromised. You are doing this willingly. You are doing this on your own terms. I need that on record. On record, Clara said. Willingly. My terms. Mercer wrote something. I put my hand over Clara's on the table, and she looked down at it and then looked at me, and I could see in her face the thing she would not say out loud, some particular exhausted relief. The relief of a person who has been waiting a very long time to stop surviving and start doing something. Nate was already pulling equipment from his duffel bag. He took out something that looked in its packaging like nothing more remarkable than a standard wound dressing kit, the kind sold in every pharmacy. He laid it on the table and opened it. This is a micro-alarm unit, he said, speaking to Clara. It's approximately the size of a grain of rice. I'm going to secure it under a standard adhesive bandage on your inner wrist, the kind you'd have from an IV site, which you actually do have, so it will look entirely natural. The unit transmits a continuous signal to a receiver in Detective Mercer's vehicle and to my monitor in the surveillance van. If the signal is interrupted, meaning if someone removes the bandage or if you press this specific point twice, he indicated a location on the unit. It transmits an emergency pulse that supersedes everything else on the channel. Clara extended her wrist. Nate worked with the steady precision of someone for whom this was an entirely ordinary task, which was, I thought, exactly the quality you needed in a person doing this particular work. When he was done, the bandage looked exactly like the other IV site dressing still on her arm from the hospital. Identical. Unremarkable. Clara looked at her wrist. Then she looked at me. 3 years ago, she said, I walked into that house because I loved a man and I believed that love was a kind of protection. I found out it wasn't. She said it without bitterness, factually, clinically, the way she had said most things. Tonight, I'm walking back in for a completely different reason. She stood up, picked up the discharge paperwork from the table, and straightened the collar of the borrowed cardigan with one precise motion. Don't be late, Avery. I stood up too. I wanted to say something that was equal to the moment, something worthy of what she was choosing to do, and what it had cost her to be in a position to choose it. Everything I thought of sounded inadequate. I settled for the truth. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met, I said. Something moved in her face. Not the practiced flatness she wore most of the time, but something underneath it. Something tired and warm and genuinely touched that she tamped back down quickly, the way people do when they are not yet practiced at receiving certain things. Don't be late, she said again. And she walked out of the conference room, down the hall, and out into the gray November afternoon. I watched Detective Mercer's unmarked car pull away from the curb below Liam's window 10 minutes later, Clara visible through the rear window, looking straight ahead. The plan was what it was: simple enough to work, complicated enough to go wrong in a dozen ways, dependent on a woman who had every right to walk away, deciding instead to walk back in. I held on to the simplicity of it. I held on to it, as Liam would say, very hard. Julian came home on Thursday evening at precisely 6:44. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock. Not conspicuously, not with my eyes fixed on it, but the way you track time, when time is the thing that matters most, checking it at intervals, with the peripheral accuracy of someone who cannot afford to miss anything. I heard the garage door. I heard his car. I heard the door from the garage open and his footsteps on the kitchen tile. He said hello and kissed me, and then he went upstairs. He always went upstairs first when he came home. I had assumed for 4 years that it was to change out of his work clothes. That was what he told me once early in our marriage when I had asked. I had not thought about it since. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened. The house was very quiet in the way that old houses are quiet, full of small sounds settling and breathing, all of which I knew, none of which I was listening to. I was listening for his footsteps overhead, tracking their movement across the ceiling. Master bedroom. Pause. The unmistakable quiet of the keypad entering and the mechanical release. He was in the vault, I counted. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Then the footsteps again out of the bedroom down the hall, descending the stairs with the ease of a man who had found what he came to find. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs. His face was composed and pleasant the way it always was. His jacket was off his sleeves, already rolled. He looked at me across the front hall and smiled. "Smells good," he said. "Did you cook?" "Dorothy left something in the oven," I said. "Are you hungry?" "Starving." He put a hand on my shoulder briefly as he passed the gesture of a man who is comfortable in his home and comfortable with his wife, and went into the kitchen. I followed him. I set the table. I poured water. I asked about his day, and he told me about a deposition that had run long, about a junior associate at the firm who was showing promise about a restaurant in the South End where his client had taken him for lunch. He was talking the way he always talked, fully, easily, with the confidence of a man who knows he is interesting and has never needed to perform it. I laughed in the right places. I asked the right questions. My hands moved through the motions of an ordinary evening with a precision that I could feel in my own chest as a kind of controlled, deliberate theater. But something was different tonight. It was not visible. I could not have pointed to anything specific and said there, that gesture, that word, that look. It was a quality of attention, the same quality I had noticed from him when he was most focused on a problem. A slight narrowing of his concentration, a fractional delay in his responses, the way a man listens when he is listening to more than one thing at once. He was watching me. Not the way he usually watched me, with the warm, expansive attention of a husband who loves his wife. He was watching me the way a lawyer watches a witness, looking not at what was being said, but at what was being carefully not said. I noticed it, and I did not let anything in my face change, and that not letting anything change was the hardest work I had ever done. After dinner, he poured himself bourbon and stood by the kitchen window looking out at the November dark. The tree line at the back of the property barely visible against the sky. I was loading the dishwasher. I could feel the quality of his attention even with my back to him. He didn't say anything for a long moment after dinner. He stood by the kitchen window with his bourbon glass in his hand, looking out at the dark tree line at the back of the property. Not at me. That was new. Julian always looked at me when he was thinking about me. Then he set the glass down on the windowsill unfinished, which he almost never did, and turned. "I've been thinking about the bedroom," he said. My chest went cold. I kept my face neutral. "What about it?" "The paint. You mentioned having it done while I was in Boston." He looked at me with the particular quality of attention I had come to understand was not warmth, but measurement, the look of a man running a calculation behind his eyes while his face stayed perfectly still. "How did it go?" "Fine," I said. "Silas did good work. I'll show you in the morning if you want." He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man filing something away for later. "Good," he said. "That's good." He walked out of the kitchen without touching the bourbon again. I stood at the sink and stared at the unfinished glass on the windowsill and thought, he has already been in the vault. He went there the moment he came home tonight. And now he is asking me about the painter. He is connecting the dots in the wrong order, but he is connecting them. 3 days. We had 3 days left, and the window was getting smaller by the hour. I heard him stop at the bottom of the stairs. Then his voice came back, measured and easy, the voice of a man with nothing on his mind. "Early night," he called back into the kitchen. "I have briefs to review before morning." "Okay," I said, to the empty kitchen, to the unfinished bourbon on the windowsill. "Good night." I listened to him go upstairs. I stood at the dishwasher with my hand on the door, and I breathed very carefully, very deliberately, until my heartbeat came down from where it had gone. He had not believed me. I could see it in the way he held that glass without drinking in the half-second delay, before each answer in the top-of-the-head kiss, instead of the cheek kiss that 4 years of habit should have made automatic. Julian Sterling had spent 15 years reading rooms and reading people, and I was not, no matter how good my performance had been tonight, a trained actress. I was a 25-year-old woman who had found out 2 days ago that her husband was planning to kill her, and some fragment of that knowledge, despite everything, was visible to him. He was recalculating. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, not yet visible, not yet definitive, but present and building. He had 3 days on his calendar. I had 3 days on mine. And both of us, standing in the kitchen of the house my grandmother had built, were now waiting for the same end with entirely different expectations of what that ending looked like. 3 days. I drove to Liam's office the next morning with that number sitting in my chest like something with weight, and I thought we had better be ready before he is. Friday morning, I came downstairs at 7:30 to find Julian already at the kitchen table with coffee, and his laptop working through what looked like a stack of briefs. He glanced up when I came in that quick, assessing glance I had learned to read in the last 48 hours, and then back down at his work. I poured coffee. I stood at the counter for a moment, looking out at the November yard, the oak trees stripped, now the sky, the particular shade of pale gray that meant cold and probably rain before evening. Then I turned around and said, as if the thought had come to me in the night, the way ideas do when you have been lying awake working through them for hours, I think I need a few days away. Julian looked up. My college roommate Sarah has been asking me to visit for months, I said. She moved to Charlotte 2 years ago, married someone I've only met twice, and I've been a genuinely terrible friend about getting down there. I thought this week might be a good time. I thought I'd drive down this morning, stay through Sunday, maybe Monday. I let a small, genuine-sounding tiredness into my voice. The tiredness of a woman who has not been sleeping well and is believably asking for rest. I need to clear my head. Julian looked at me. I watched his face the way I had been watching it since Tuesday, cataloging it, reading the micro-adjustments, the thousandths of a second in which the surface expression and the thinking behind it ran slightly out of sync. Something moved in his eyes. Brief. Gone almost before it registered. Then he smiled. That sounds like exactly what you need, he said. His voice was warm, encouraging, the voice of a husband who loves his wife and wants her to rest. He looked genuinely relieved, not the relieved of someone who has just been told good news, but the relieved of someone who has just been handed a solution to a problem they had been working on. That relief told me everything. I packed a bag while he was still at the kitchen table. I kissed him goodbye at the front door. He held my face in both hands for a moment, a gesture he had used since early in our marriage, tender and particular, and said, "Drive safe. Call me when you get there." I said I would. He watched me walk to my car from the front step. I drove out through the iron gates and did not look in the rearview mirror. 4 blocks from the estate, I turned onto a side street and parked behind a hardware store, and 2 minutes later, Nate's surveillance van pulled in beside me. It was a white commercial cargo van with the name of a plumbing supply company stenciled on the side, nondescript, the kind of vehicle that can sit on a residential street for 2 days without attracting attention. Inside, it had been converted into something that looked considerably less like a delivery vehicle: 2 folding workstations, a bank of monitors connected to a field recording system, a thermal imaging display already showing the heat signatures of the Miller estate 200 yards away. The milk carton camera I had placed in the refrigerator on Wednesday morning, Nate had walked me through the setup over the phone, and it had taken 40 seconds to position, was broadcasting on the upper left monitor a clear, slightly fisheye view of the kitchen interior. Liam was already in the van when I climbed in. Mercer was there too, in plain clothes, a radio on the seat beside her. Nate was at the workstation with his coffee, and the steady, self-contained focus of someone who has done this particular kind of waiting many times before. "He went back inside immediately after you left," Nate said without looking up from his screen. "Went upstairs. Vault. 7 minutes." So he had gone straight to her. I filed that away. The next 18 hours were the particular purgatory of surveillance. Long stretches of ordinary footage interrupted by moments of dense significance that required full attention. Julian moved through the house with the ease of a man who believed himself unobserved. He made lunch. He took a call in his study that Nate captured and would later have transcribed. He went back to the vault twice more in the afternoon, staying longer each time. Saturday morning, the camera showed him carrying a large, hard-sided suitcase down the stairs and setting it in the front hall. He spent 40 minutes in the vault. When he came back downstairs, the suitcase was still there. He carried it to the hall closet and pushed it in behind the coats. "What is in that suitcase?" Liam said. None of us answered because none of us knew, and not knowing made the van feel smaller. Saturday evening, Julian cooked dinner for one. He ate at the kitchen island with a book open beside his plate, unhurried, entirely at ease. He looked like a man enjoying a quiet evening at home. He looked like a man with nothing at all on his mind. That look, I had come to understand, was the most dangerous version of Julian Sterling. At 11 Saturday night, the kitchen camera caught him at the counter. He had changed into dark clothing, not conspicuous, just dark, and he was working at the cutting board with careful, deliberate movements. Nate zoomed in. On the cutting board was a steak, and on the counter beside it was a small brown bottle and a syringe still in its packaging. "He's lacing it," Nate said. His voice was flat and certain. "The UV dye is already in the steak. We added it to the refrigerator supply when Avery installed the camera. He doesn't know it's there. Whatever he's adding from that bottle is something else." "The syringe," Mercer said. "The syringe," Nate confirmed. Mercer picked up her radio. Then she looked at me. "He's moved the timeline. He's not waiting for the birthday." She said it without urgency, the way detectives say the things they have been preparing for and are now watching arrive. "We go tonight." I looked at the monitor. Julian was standing in the kitchen of my grandmother's house, in the house that had my name on the deed, and his hands on every surface, humming something I couldn't identify, working with the calm precision of a man performing a task he had performed in his mind hundreds of times. He thought he was alone. He thought I was in Charlotte. He thought Clara was exactly where he had left her, waiting in the dark behind the wall. He was wrong about all three of those things, and in a few hours he was going to find out. The thermal sensor registered movement toward the vault door at 1:47 in the morning. Nobody in the van said a word. Nate turned up the audio feed. The microphones embedded in the hallway picked up footsteps. The particular, unhurried footsteps of a man moving through his own home in the dark, confident and unrushed. Mercer picked up her radio and said 2 words to the units she had staged 3 streets over. Liam put his coffee down and did not pick it up again. I put my hand flat on the table in front of me, pressing my palm against the surface until I could feel the grain of the metal through my skin, needing something solid. On the monitor, the thermal display showed Julian as a bright shape moving down the upstairs hallway. The kitchen camera was dark. He had turned off the lights, working by the glow of his phone, which Nate had been tracking for the last hour. He stopped at the wardrobe. The keypad glowed briefly. The steel door opened. He went in. The micro-alarm on Clara's wrist was transmitting steady and clear, a constant pulse on Nate's secondary monitor that meant she was conscious that she was unharmed, that the signal had not been triggered. I watched that pulse the way you watch a heartbeat on a medical monitor, willing it to stay even. Julian was in the vault for 4 minutes before anything changed. Then the audio feed picked up his voice, low, conversational, the tone he used when he was being precisely and deliberately gentle, which I had once thought was his natural voice, and now understood was a register he deployed the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. I could not make out every word through the recording. I heard my name once. I heard the word soon. I heard very clearly the sound of a tray being set down on a surface. Mercer was already moving. She pressed the radio transmit twice the signal to the staged units. Her voice was completely level. "We go in 60 seconds, she said. "On my mark." I was in the van. That had been the plan. I would be in the van, safe, out of the way, watching on monitors while the professionals did what professionals do. That had been Liam's very clear and very reasonable instruction, and I had agreed to it completely, standing in Liam's conference room on a Thursday afternoon. What I had not told Liam, because I had not yet decided it myself until this moment, was that I was not going to stay in the van. I opened the van door. Liam said my name sharply once. I heard Mercer say something on the radio. Then I was outside in the November cold, moving toward the iron gates of the Miller estate, which one of Mercer's officers had already opened from inside, and I was through them, and up the front steps, and in the front door, which had been unlocked for exactly this purpose, and up the staircase. Two of Mercer's officers were already in position in the hallway outside the bedroom, pressed against the wall on either side of the wardrobe. It had been moved back to its original position by Thursday, by an officer with a furniture dolly, and the good sense not to ask too many questions. The steel door was closed but not locked from inside. One of them looked at me. I put my finger to my lips. He did not try to stop me. Days later, when things were quiet enough to have the conversation, Mercer told me she had made the call herself. She had watched me on the van monitor the moment I stood up, and she had a choice order: 2 officers to physically remove me from an active scene, pulling them off position at the worst possible moment, or let me through and keep me in her direct line of sight. "You were never supposed to be in that room," she said, "but pulling you out would have created more chaos than containing you." She looked at me with the expression of a woman who had made a compromise she was not entirely at peace with. "Don't make me do that again." I told her I wouldn't. That was mostly true. The steel door opened silently. Mercer had insisted on lubricating the hinges during the Thursday inspection, which I had thought at the time was an excess of preparation, and now understood was exactly the right call. The vault was lit by the monitor screens, that cold, flat blue light I had stood in once before. Julian was at the desk, his back to the door, leaning over Clara with the syringe in his hand. The steak was on a tray beside the desk, cut into pieces, the UV dye in it, invisible to the naked eye, present and waiting. Clara was seated at the desk. Her wrist was in Julian's hand. The needle was a centimeter from her skin. 2 things happened at almost exactly the same moment. The alarm on Clara's wrist activated not the emergency pulse, but the standard signal Nate had set to broadcast when the subject's vitals indicated acute stress, which hers very certainly did. And the lights came on. Not the soft overhead light, but the full-spectrum portable units Mercer's team had staged in the hallway, flooding the vault through the open door with the kind of light that leaves nowhere to hide. Julian spun. He was still holding the syringe. His face did something I had never seen it do in 4 years. It came apart. Not into fear, not into anger, but into the expression of a man whose model of the world has just failed completely, who is processing in real time the fact that the thing he thought was true is not true, and has not been true for longer than he knows. Under the UV light Mercer had set mounted in the hallway, the dye on his hands from the laced steak was suddenly vividly visible, a bright chemical blue that covered his fingers and the cuffs of his dark shirt, and could not be mistaken for anything other than exactly what it was. I stepped out of the doorway and into the vault. "Julian," I said. He looked at me. His chest rose and fell once hard. He looked at the syringe in his hand, at the handcuffs Mercer was already crossing the room with, at the 2 officers now in the doorway, at Nate's camera in the corner that had been recording everything for the last 4 minutes. He looked at Clara, who was sitting with her chin up and her hands flat on the desk and her eyes completely steady. Then he looked back at me, and I saw it, the thing underneath the performance, the thing that had been under it all along, the thing Julian Sterling had spent his entire life learning to hide. Not anger, not arrogance, something much smaller and much more desperate than either. "You chose the wrong woman to put to sleep," I said. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Julian Sterling, who had an answer for everything, who had spent 15 years building the language of his own invulnerability, stood in the blue-white light of his own vault, with the evidence of his own attempt glowing on his hands, and he had nothing. They put the handcuffs on him at 2:14 in the morning. He looked at me one last time over his shoulder as they walked him out, and I understood what that look was. He was waiting for me to flinch. He was waiting even now for the version of me he had constructed, manageable, trusting, appropriately awed by his competence, to reassert itself and make this make sense. I did not flinch. I watched him walk through the steel door and out of my house, and I did not look away because I wanted him to carry the image of my face completely steady into everything that came next. Julian's bail hearing was at 9 o'clock Sunday morning. I sat in the 3rd row of the gallery with Liam on my left and an empty seat on my right, in a courtroom that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. And I watched my husband stand at the defense table in a suit that someone had brought him from his closet at the estate. Charcoal gray, well cut, the kind of suit that communicated competence and credibility, even in a context where those qualities were actively working against you. His attorney, a criminal defense specialist from Charlotte named Garrett Voss, who had apparently been on retainer for Julian for 2 years, which told me something about the degree to which Julian had always expected to need him, argued that his client posed no flight risk, was a respected member of the legal community, and that the charges, while serious, were subject to significant reinterpretation. The judge was the Honorable Thomas Aldridge, the same man who would later preside over the full trial assigned to the case from its first hearing. He was in his late 50s, known in Buncombe County legal circles for a methodical precision that left very little room for theater. He reviewed the 7-count charging document without visible expression. He listened to Garrett Voss make the case for bail. He looked at Julian once briefly, the way a man looks at something he has already made up his mind about. Then he looked back at the filing. "Bail is denied," he said. His voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a man who had rendered this particular verdict before, and would render it again. "The defendant poses a significant flight risk given the financial structures identified in the filing, and represents a continued danger to the primary witness. Remand is ordered." He moved to the next case before Voss had finished gathering his papers. Julian was led out of the courtroom. He did not look at me. I had thought sitting there that he might look at me one more time, one more attempt to see if the version of me he had built still existed somewhere. He didn't. He walked out with his attorney and the marshal, and he did not turn his head. And I sat there and watched him go, and felt for the first time in 4 days something that was not vigilance or performance or controlled fear. I felt tired. Deeply, genuinely, all the way down tired, the tiredness of someone who has been holding a shape for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. Liam put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "That's done," he said. It was not a minimization, it was an acknowledgement. That part of it was done. There was more, and it would take months. And we would have to go through all of it, but that piece, the piece that had kept me awake since Tuesday with the particular alertness of a person in active danger, was over. I drove to the Miller estate alone. I had not planned to go back. I had imagined in the fragments of non-planning that passed for private thought in the last 4 days that I would simply not return, that the estate would pass into the custody of the investigation, that the lawyers and the detectives and the forensic accountants would handle what needed to be handled, and that I would stay somewhere else and process from a distance. That was the sensible thing. I drove there anyway. The iron gates stood open, the investigation team had been working overnight, and the estate was still active. I nodded at the officer at the entrance and walked through the front door, and stood for a moment in my own front hall. The house looked different in Sunday morning light. All houses look different once you know what they contain. I walked through the rooms slowly, the living room, the dining room, the kitchen where Dorothy had sat across from me with a grocery bag of scratched clean vials, and the courage to say, "I think there is something wrong in this house." The kitchen looked ordinary. The counters were clean. The refrigerator door was closed. You would not have known standing there that it had a camera in a milk carton broadcasting to a van 2 streets over. I went upstairs. The master bedroom had been processed, evidence markers on the floor, the wardrobe photographed in both its positions. The vault open and empty, now, of everything except the concrete and the scratch marks and the cot. The forensics team had taken the servers, the desk, the chain, the cot, all of it. What was left was a small, bare room, and in the morning light it looked exactly like what it had always been beneath its terrible purpose, a storage space in someone's home repurposed for something no storage space should ever be used for. I stood in the doorway of the vault and looked at the scratch marks on the wall. 41 rows of 5. 205 days, I thought. No months. 41 months. The marks were made with something hard, a key perhaps, or the edge of a chain link, and they were perfectly regular, as if keeping count was the last form of control available to the person keeping them, and she had exercised it with absolute precision. I put my hand flat against the wall beside the marks. The concrete was cold. Then I walked back out through the bedroom, down the hall, down the stairs, through the front door, and out into the November morning. I did not look back at the house. I got in my car and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the front facade of the building that had been in my family for 3 generations, that had my grandmother's hand in every room, and my name on the deed, and 4 years of my married life on every surface. I called a real estate agent named Carol Hutchins, who had sold my mother's second home 8 years ago and had a reputation for moving properties quickly. She answered on the second ring. "Carol." I said, "I need to sell a house on Miller Estate Road, reasonably quickly. Can we talk this week?" There was a brief pause. "Of course," she said. "Is there anything I should know about the property first?" I looked through the windshield at the iron gates standing open at the oak trees dropping their last leaves in the gray morning light. "Just that it's time," I said. "It's past time." 3 weeks after the arrest that shattered the facade of my life, Detective Mercer called me into her office at the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department. Her office was a testament to utility: a metal desk, a whiteboard recently wiped clean of connections, and 2 cups of mediocre break-room coffee. She told me she wasn't legally required to share the full scope of the case with me, but in her experience, victims fared better when they understood the complete picture rather than receiving the fragmented truths of a public trial. I sat across from her and asked for everything. Mercer opened a file several inches thick and began to dismantle the man I thought I had married layer by calculated layer. The first layer was the physical evidence of that final night. The state crime lab had confirmed that the UV reactive compound found on Julian's hands matched the tracing agent Nate had recommended we add to the food supply. Under 365 nanometer light, his guilt had literally fluoresced. More chilling was the analysis of the syringe recovered at the scene. It did not contain a sedative or a paralytic. It was loaded with a concentrated pharmaceutical-grade respiratory depressant. At the volume Julian had prepared, it would have caused respiratory failure in a woman of Clara's weight within 4 minutes. It was a tool designed specifically to stop a heart from beating. "This is the basis for attempted first-degree murder," Mercer explained. Between the physical evidence at the scene and the planning evidence, the insurance policy, the psychiatric files, and the calendar notations, premeditation was undeniable. Under North Carolina law, this Class B1 felony carried a potential sentence of 12 to 25 years, without the possibility of parole. The second layer involved the digital and financial labyrinth Nate had pulled from the vault's servers. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had spent 3 weeks untangling a network of shell companies Julian had established in Delaware, Wyoming, and South Dakota, states chosen for their lack of beneficial owner disclosure laws. The scope was staggering. Over 36 months, Julian had moved $11.4 million through this system. While $4.2 million was traced directly to the Miller Family Trust, the remaining $7.2 million was still being sourced, though the FBI had strong leads. The sophistication of the routing structures Clara had been forced to build was so high that even federal forensic accountants struggled to map them. Julian faced a mountain of federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement, prosecuted in tandem with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The third layer focused on the paper trail. 2 independent forensic experts concluded that the signature on the forged will was a traced reproduction. Julian had spent years handling my legal documents, learning exactly how to mimic the lines of my hand. Furthermore, the investigation had reached the psychiatrist in Hendersonville. Facing the weight of the evidence, the doctor had retained an attorney and agreed to cooperate for reduced charges. He admitted that the sessions mentioned in the files never occurred. The clinical notes describing my mental instability had been written entirely to Julian's specifications. These revelations added charges of forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder to the growing list. Mercer closed the conspiracy section of the file and looked at me over the edge of it. "There's one more thing," she said. "About Ms. Vance." I waited. The district attorney's office is granting full immunity to Clara Vance in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. Under the agreement, all chargeable offenses connected to the shell company activity, and there were chargeable offenses I want to be direct about that are being declined on the basis of prosecutorial discretion and documented duress. Every company, every account, every signature that carries her name, the record is being corrected. Legally, officially, permanently. She paused. "It won't give her back 3 years, but it gives her back her name." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding since Tuesday. "Thank you," I said, not just to Mercer, to the whole long, terrible chain of events that had somehow produced this particular outcome. "For all of it." Mercer looked at me without expression. Then she said, "Thank Dorothy Harlan. She's the one who noticed." She closed the file. "Do your job, and the evidence does the rest." Julian's trial lasted 11 days. I was there for every one of them, sitting in the 3rd row on the left, directly behind the prosecution table. I sat there and watched the case against my husband be assembled in public before 12 jurors and the continuous clicking of the court reporter's machine. There is a strange particularity in hearing evidence you already know spoken aloud in a formal setting. It transforms horrific memories into an undeniable legal record. This was no longer just my private nightmare. It had become a truth recognized by the world. The case quickly captured public attention. From local papers, the story of Julian Sterling, a partner at a prestigious law firm married to the heir of the Miller Trust, arrested at 2 a.m. with a murder weapon, and UV reactive evidence on his hands, spread to national outlets. Garrett Voss, Julian's attorney, fought the charges with all his skill. He attempted to challenge the admissibility of the server logs, arguing unauthorized access. However, Judge Thomas Aldridge, a man known for meticulousness and an immunity to courtroom theater, denied the motion. He ruled that the system was accessed via its own internal connection while the party was cooperating with an active investigation. The evidence stood. On day 4, Nate Cross testified for 4 hours. He explained technical metadata with such patience and clarity that the defense's argument of evidence manipulation collapsed in public. The jurors watched Nate as if he held the key to the truth. Day 6 belonged to Clara. In the months following the arrest, Clara and I had met several times. She was recovering with the help of a specialist in long-term captivity trauma. Clara had moved into a small apartment in West Asheville with large windows, a deliberate choice to compensate for the years spent in darkness. At trial, Clara answered questions for 7 hours with a flat, absolute precision. She described 41 months of captivity in detail: the forced labor, Julian's control system, the threats, the rationed meals, and the way she counted days to maintain her sanity. When Voss suggested that the conditions in the vault were somewhat consensual, Clara looked directly at him and said, "The chain on my ankle was bolted into the floor. I'd be interested to understand your theory of consent." The courtroom went silent and the jurors began to look at Julian differently. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all 7 counts. The following morning, Judge Aldridge delivered the sentence. Julian stood in his gray suit, still attempting to project an image of composure, a final performance of competence. But the judge did not use dry legal jargon. He looked at Julian and said, "Mr. Sterling, I have sentenced men who acted out of desperation, addiction, or poverty. You are none of those things. You are an educated man with every advantage, yet you used the instruments of law to build a mechanism for the destruction of 2 women's lives in service of money you did not need and control you chose to want. You built a prison inside a home and called it a marriage. The court hopes you will have a great deal of time to reflect on the difference." The total sentence amounted to 23 years in state prison. Judge Aldridge had imposed consecutive sentences on the 3 most serious counts: attempted murder in the first degree, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder, and concurrent sentences on the remaining 4. Liam walked me through the arithmetic afterward in the courthouse hallway, his voice low and precise, the way it always was when he was making sure I understood something completely. The consecutive counts alone carried a minimum active term of 23 years before parole eligibility under North Carolina's structured sentencing guidelines. The concurrent counts added nothing to the number but added everything to the record. His law license had been formally revoked by the North Carolina State Bar the week prior. Julian Sterling would not practice law again. Julian did not flinch when the number was read. He stood straight, controlling every muscle in his face to deny the room the satisfaction of seeing him break. However, in my eyes, that control looked small and pathetic. It was a shell and nothing more. As he was let out, he looked at me one last time over his shoulder. I did not flinch or look away. I did not give him the version of me he was looking for. The courtroom door closed. Julian was gone. I walked out of the courthouse and into the November light, the real, cold, clear light of the world. I pulled on my coat, took a deep breath, and began to walk. My world was finally beginning. 1 year after leaving the heavy shadows of the Miller estate, I received a photo from Clara on a quiet Wednesday morning. In the image, she stood proudly outside her new financial planning and fraud prevention office in Asheville. Her smile wasn't the guarded, fragile expression from the hospital or the intensity of the witness box. It was an actual, unguarded smile, the look of someone who has finally realized the next thing is just an ordinary afternoon. My life has transformed in ways I once thought impossible. I moved into a sunlit craftsman bungalow featuring a wide front porch and a blooming dogwood tree. There are no forbidden rooms here, no hidden deadbolts, and no one manages when I sleep or what I eat. The Miller estate was sold in March to a young family who knew nothing of its dark history. Signing those final papers brought the quiet lightness of a task finally finished. Using the sale proceeds, I established a dedicated fund for survivors of long-term domestic confinement, a critical gap I discovered in existing support systems. Detective Mercer helped coordinate the legalities, and Clara agreed to join the advisory committee when she felt ready. I often sit on my porch now watching the gold light filter through the leaves. The terror has faded into a dull memory replaced by the mundane beauty of autonomy. I am no longer a character in someone else's twisted narrative. I am the sole author of my own days. The hidden doors are all open now, and for the first time in a decade, I am not afraid of what lies behind them. Justice was a loud, chaotic storm, but peace is this: a cup of tea, a silent house, and the freedom to breathe. That's how it all comes to a close. I'm glad you were here. See you next. Looking back on this journey, I realize how blind I truly was. I once believed that wealth and a perfect marriage were my shields, but in reality, that absolute trust is exactly what plunged me into a harrowing family betrayal. Don't be like me. Don't let artificial warmth cloud your judgment. In love, staying alert isn't a lack of trust. It's the only way to protect yourself from the most brutal forms of family betrayal. I believe we all have a mission, and perhaps God allowed me to endure this pain so that I could rise up and help others in similar shadows. Life isn't always rosy, and the truth is often more terrifying than a horror movie. My act of family revenge wasn't fueled by blind hatred, but by the necessity of reclaiming justice for myself and for Clara. The sweetest family revenge is living a vibrant, free life while leaving the villain to rot in the darkness of his own making. We cannot choose the family we are born into, or the person we happen to love, but we can choose how to end a family betrayal. Never stay silent when you see red flags, for silence is the ultimate accomplice to crime. Justice may be delayed, but it always finds its way home. And a rightful family revenge closes the dark chapters to let the light back in.
And that's how it's all come to a close. I'm glad you were here. See you next time.